Hi there and welcome to the Byline podcast with me, Adrian Goldberg. This time, Tenet, Doppelganger and Vatnik Soup as we explore Russia's attempts to influence Western democracy using disinformation, covert media campaigns and troll farms. Tenet is a Tennessee-based company linked to right-wing influencers, which, according to the US Justice Department, received nearly $10 million from RT, formerly Russia Today, to promote pro-Kremlin propaganda. The Justice Department also seized more than 30 website domains, which it says were cloning reputable news sites such as The Washington Post and diverting readers to fake news sites instead. These were the Doppelgangers. We're joined by Pekka. Pekka K is the author of Vatnik Soup, originally a Twitter thread, now a book, which seeks to expose the methodology of Moscow's information war, especially on social media. And we're also joined by Peter Jukes, the Byline Times executive editor, who has had a keen eye across Russian disinformation for many years. Pekka, I want to start with you. Before we get into the specifics of Russian disinformation, just tell me how you got involved in this work in the first place.
So my background is in academia, and I studied and I researched social media and algorithms, which then, after Russia launched their full-scale invasion in Ukraine, led me to studying Russian online disinformation and information operations. That's basically how I got interested. I started Vatnik Soup on Twitter in October of 2022, and it got pretty popular pretty quickly, and I decided, okay, if today this is popular, then I'm gonna do it again tomorrow, and that's how I just started doing them. And yeah, now it's been almost 3 years, and now I'm publishing it as a book, so it's been an interesting 3 years.
Peter, when did you first become aware of Russian disinformation?
Not dissimilar to Pekka. I mean, I actually went to Ukraine just after the Maidan, so I could tell the lies being told about it. Didn't know how those lies were perpetuated. I think around the Trump campaign and Brexit 2016. And then, of course, I worked with Carol Cadwallader on Cambridge Analytica, which it looks like, worked with the Russians. Maybe even their targeting software was handed over to a GRU agent, Kalimik, because even in these indictments the other day, they talk about the psychological profiling of the effects of their propaganda. So I think what we're looking at, that was related to Prigozhin. Evgeny Prigozhin, his famous troll farm in the Olgino suburb of St. Petersburg. Prigozhin also ran Concord. He was an oligarch who then rebelled against Putin and died mysteriously in a plane crash last year. But we are now seeing the development of those techniques, which were investigated. Don't forget that Special Investigation Special Counsel Robert Mueller exposed this $50 million paid to the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. That got exposed, and Pekka's been brilliant at this. New things have come to replace it.
You mentioned troll farms there. Pekka, tell me about troll farms first off then. Is this where Russian disinformation originates?
Yeah, just like Peter said, in 2013, the Internet Research Agency was established by Yevgeny Prigozhin. And these troll farms, they're basically factories of propaganda and disinformation. People work in shifts and they produce online commentary and content that is kind of sowing division in Western nations, but also promoting Kremlin narratives online. So it's something that's been going on for over 10 years, of course. But again, it has evolved into something very different system today. So troll farms, they exist, but they are just one part of this huge machinery of disinformation and propaganda.
And yet the recent indictments in the United States reference RT, Russia Today, which was a television channel. Is it just a sign of how disinformation has moved that you had RT and that the disinformation and misinformation subsequently then moved online, or were they all working in parallel?
Yeah, originally RT was basically just providing an alternative pro-Kremlin viewpoint on news for the West. but it quickly became just another propaganda leg of the Kremlin. And these days it is also used, as we saw with the latest indictment, to fund operations in the West. And of course, another one would be Sputnik, but that's basically more focused in Africa and in South America. But RT and Sputnik are basically kind of propaganda legs of the Kremlin, and they are being used to fund these malign operations.
And we've spoken a lot on this podcast to Zarina Zabriskie, who is reporting for Byline Times in Ukraine, and Heidi Sigmund Kuda as well. And they talk about hybrid war, the way in which Russia has established war on a number of fronts, obviously a military war in Ukraine, but this disinformation war on the West as well. And it's all part of the same overriding desire to do down the West and promote Russian interests.
If you look at cost effectiveness, I don't know how much a MiG or an Su-8 or whatever they are now, or one of their missiles costs, but the bangs for bucks, you can spend, as they did, or alleged to do, $10 million to a shell company in London, to American media influencers with, millions of followers, and you may do more for your cause than kinetic warfare, than a missile. Certainly, can I just say, when I returned from after the Maidan from Ukraine, a lot of my friends say, "Oh, isn't Ukraine full of Nazis?" Or the CIA planned that uprising. Oh, and so that is a very effective counter to anything being done, and actually allowed Russia almost with impunity to take over Crimea and invade the Donbass. I think what Pekka's also saying is that it is like an arms race. Once the Internet Research Agency was identified, once other people understood the idea of these bot networks, which could amplify and game the algorithm, new things need to take their place. And the arms race was two things. One is what Pekka's written for us today on Byline Times with Tenet and these sort of big American and Canadian social media influences, it's super spreaders. What you get is you don't have a troll farm. What you get is you buy, even if they don't realize they're being bought, you buy people with a lot of social media impact. And then this other indictment, which is about the Doppelganger, and this is where Byline Times appears in the indictment, not as an indictee, as part of the evidence, Serena's piece on Doppelganger. And that is replicating at scale legitimate news sites and diverting them with Kremlin messages. And Pekka's right. I mean, remember that Putin is a ex-KGB agent, right? He's not a soldier. This social design agency, which is behind these doppelganger things, reports direct to him. And it's very clever. He never says, "Oh, isn't Putin great?" It's all done by sowing distrust or, "Oh, the Ukrainians are Nazis." So they're not looking, and Pekka's the expert on this, I can't wait for his book. They're not looking to go, "We love Vladimir Putin." They're looking to go, "We don't trust anybody." Zelensky's you see these tweets, particularly on X now, it's swarming with these paid for bots. "Oh, Zelensky's the richest man in the world." And all they need to do is suppress your support for Putin's enemies for him to win.
And also the general idea, I think people perceive it kind of wrong, is that, okay, the Kremlin wants the candidate A or candidate B to win. That's wrong. That's not probably their goal. Their goal is to create polarization in Western nations where we are stuck kind of in a conflict of domestic policies. So basically, okay, immigration or inflation. And when you have these kind of domestic conflicts, your foreign policy is weak. Like we saw with the Ukraine aid, it took months and months for the US government to send this big package of military aid to Ukraine because they were infighting. So this is basically their ultimate goal. And of course, number one goal right now is to prevent any aid to Ukraine. And they are basically doing this by polarizing and kind of sowing distrust and mistrust inside communities, because it's very cynical system. There is not really like goal, but they just wanna polarize populations.
And as an example of that, Pekka, you've studied how Russian disinformation played a role in inciting and inflaming the riots, the far right riots in the UK after the tragic murder of three girls in Southport.
Yes. So, for example, a lot of pro-Kremlin accounts shared this content online. And one of them, of course, was Tommy Robinson, who actually visited Russia and allegedly was looking into transferring money to Russian accounts, to Russian banks. But for example, one Tommy Robinson post on X got 11 million impressions. So allegedly 11 million people saw that post. And it was basically a list of riots in different cities. And one of them was a hotel where migrants were attacked. So as Peter mentioned before, the super spreader accounts, so big accounts that have a huge following, they have a massive influence online. And this influence online can also be transferred to real world. And the aftermath of the Southport attack was clear evidence of that. And of course, Nigel Farage was pushing that. Andrew Tate was pushing that narrative also. It's just how quickly this information spreads online. It's extremely harmful to our Western democracies.
Just to add to that, the man who set fire to that hostel has been sentenced to 9 years. Fortunately, nobody was killed. Panorama, BBC, did a report about the radicalization of young men watching Andrew Tate kind of material. It was a good program, Mariana Spring, but Elliot Higgins from Bellingcat made the point it's not just the disinformation. Discord, 4chan, 8chan, all these places then allow real life gatherings. And the riots example of a real life gathering. But mark my words, and we've written about this, hopefully Pekka will write more for Byline Times, there's a direct connection between those riots and what's going on in America at the moment, the attempts around insurrection. I mean, it is with the Tenet organization, it's pretty clear cut. They said, Ukraine's useless, let's not defend it, yeah? So it becomes more transparent, but there is an origin and it becomes more transparent about they've always gone on. RT did the same. They were boosted by Farage and Leave EU. There's all these migrants coming, Islamophobia. There is a consistent theme which they will always push. But the amazing thing is, if anybody doubts us, is this speculation? Are we making this up? No. The FBI have published the Social Design Agency's documents. And they explain that's what they do. They had this funny bit, didn't they, Pekka? What we need is a story to sow dissent, anti-American feeling in Germany. Let's find a story or make up a story of a GI, an American GI, raping a German woman. You see what's going on there.
A lot of these, for example, made up sexual violence stories, there was in Germany, I think there was one in Austria, and they've been using these false narratives to kind of provoke people to speak against immigration, for example. And it's worth mentioning that a lot of the Russian disinformation that they promote, these are real things, like, for example, the farmer protests that Russia has been pushing, like farmer protests around Europe for increase of prices and so on. It's a real problem, but it's also something that can be used as a tool to polarize populations. So you can have protests, you can have whatever. So it's very easy to show that the whole Europe is in flames because of these protests, for example. So there's a huge problem with farmers in Europe or in immigration. These are real problems, but they are basically just highly exaggerated by the Russian disinformation machinery.
There's a classic example of that from the Mueller report from 2016 and the lead up to the US presidential elections, Trump and Hillary Clinton. These fake Facebook pages, and they went, Russian operatives went to America, set up these identities, they set up these Facebook pages, and they advertised. Some were like Black Lives Matter, some were gun control, some were pro-Sharia law. And I think it's in Houston, on the same day, they organized a protest in favor of guns on the same place, same square as a pro-Sharia law protest. You can see they're taking nitro, they're taking glycerine and shaking it.
To me, it seems like Russia is always one step ahead. They are one evolutionary step ahead in this information warfare. And I think in the West, we are still underestimating the whole system and we are kind of reacting where we should be planning for the future. So probably right now, Russia has been kind of planning on how to use AI in the future for these information operations. In 2017, Putin said, the country that controls the AI development controls the world. And this is probably true. And this was 2017 already. And my prediction is that AI will play a huge part in future disinformation campaigns and information operations.
I just add one thing, though. What is clear from those indictments is they've been working on them for years. They said they've been several years. They obviously been cooperating with agencies across Europe as well. That's clear. When they sanctioned these individuals, GRU unit, which was another hacking outfit, this has been a cross-border collaboration. We had the arrest of the owner of Telegram in Paris. I don't know what Pekka feels. They mentioned 2,800 influencers they're looking at, potentially be pro-Kremlin in the social design agency. And my hope is, and maybe I'm being naive, given that Biden rather than Trump in power for the last 4 years, controlling the Department of Justice and the security services, and we finally got a non-captive, non-pro-Russian prime minister here, this may be the beginning of the unraveling of it. I don't know what you think, Pekka. My feeling is that Tenet is just the tip of an iceberg.
Definitely. But I think I have to mention that Vatnik Soup now has 303 entries. So maybe it's getting close to kind of mapping out the biggest fish in the whole disinformation and propaganda system. But as I said before, I think we are always kind of one step behind with Russia. And usually these indictments show how much they have developed from the previous kind of evolutionary step in this arms race. There's always something new and there's always like a big surprise. So I've been talking about using super spreader accounts for a while now. So for me, it wasn't a surprise, but I feel like a lot of people were kind of like, how did this happen? How is this possible? Why did my favorite influencer work for Russia, for example? So people still generally don't have a clue what's going on with these operations.
I also wonder, has there been a willful ignorance on the part of politicians? Peter, I'm sure, can talk to the fact that the Joint Intelligence and Security Committee report into potential Russian influence in the UK was suppressed by Boris Johnson. It has eventually been published. Of course, the Conservative Party was taking donations from various Russian oligarchs. Johnson had this very close relationship with Evgeny Lebedev, the newspaper proprietor, who's the son of a former KGB agent, and so on. So was there a kind of determination to not see the wood for the trees by politicians?
Well, the Russia report actually says we were never tasked to look at it, and complained, and the members of the committee said, why hasn't this been done? Electoral integrity is key. Boris Johnson famously said he saw not a sausage of Russian interference, and this was around when it was so apparent, and the attempted murder of Skripal and the Novichok attack in Salisbury. So there has been both a willful blindness there, and this goes back to Theresa May as well, and the murder of Alexander Litvinenko with polonium. And I'm told by people I've spoken to the security services, government didn't want to know. And then after Brexit, it was too embarrassing. So one would hope the British have caught up with this. The Mueller report was quite good. That didn't prove collusion, but it proved a desperate, expensive influence operation in the 2016 election. Yeah, and my experience, I don't know about you, Pekka, thanks to you, people get it now. And I guess people calling everybody a Russian bot. But this super spreader is quite insidious, isn't it? Because usually these people have a record over something else and built up a track record, and then they say don't trust Ukraine. And hopefully people will be aware of this. But there's also a famous bit of spycraft. When you find these operations, let them run for a while. Find out where the money's going. So I don't know. My suspicion is that given the detail these indictments go into in terms of the comms, in terms of the money being passed by these shell companies, they're very difficult to track, that the FBI and hopefully British security services have now got quite a good picture of what's going on with this sort of network.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, money plays a big part. One of the influencers in the indictment was paid 400,000 a month for 4 videos every week. So that's like no questions asked, just produce something that we kind of want to promote. So it's crazy. I mean, Nigel Farage was employed by RT for a while, no? And of course, Nord Stream 2, these are huge projects in Germany. Gerhard Schröder was heavily involved in this. I mean, there's a lot of money involved when Russian oligarchs are doing something or Russian states. Money and greed play a big part in all this.
I mean, I must say, shouldn't we? What was merged in a court case was that two of the investors in X, in Elon Musk's takeover of that social media company with two sanctioned Russian individuals. And part of these investigations would come along with the FBI indictments are sanctions. So we are in a different world since the full-scale war against Ukraine. Russia is much more heavily sanctioned. Taking money from Russia is now breaking the law. I think the founders of Tenet have been indicted under Foreign Agents Registration Act, the FARA Act, which we don't have here, which was recommended we had here in 2016-18. So it's trickier to funnel money these days from Russia. And taking it, knowingly taking it, is illegal.
But it's still very much possible by establishing shell companies in Turkey, United Arab Emirates, or Czech Republic, or whatever. These were the countries where the companies that funneled the money for Tenet Media. So it's possible, but it's more difficult. It's more complex.
And to take the money, as I'm saying, Pekka, is that if you are American or a Brit and you take Russian money, even if it's hidden, but eventually you are technically breaking a sanction.
Yes, definitely.
You use this brilliant phrase, Pekka, the fire hose of falsehood. Just explain what you mean by that.
I think it was coined by Jay Rosen or the Rand Institute, and it's the basic system of Russian disinformation online, is that it values quantity over quality. Truth doesn't matter. You can basically say whatever you want. You can say the most outright lies. It doesn't matter. And basically, the goal is you overwhelm the opposition and people who are kind of trying to comment back or counter your ideas with just volume. And so if you have thousands of people sharing the same thing, it's very difficult to counter that.
I was chatting to Jay Rosen on this podcast just a few weeks ago, and he referenced Steve Bannon's famous phrase about filling the channel with shit and this MAGA tactic of saying all sorts of things, some of them implausible, some of them contradictory, that not mattering. The point is to sow distrust in almost any mainstream narrative so that as a viewer, you're not quite sure what you can understand. And that drives people towards their baser instincts. If you can't rationally trust anything, you have to go with feelings. And sadly, some people's feelings are crude and aggressive and nasty to people who are other than them.
Exactly. And once you kind of create this distrust of politicians, journalists, authorities, media in general, you create these cynical people who are always questioning whatever the media says. So you create a very polarized system with this kind of disinformation and propaganda.
It's funny you use that word, question everything. That was, at least in the UK, the catchphrase of RT. And there's a great book by Peter Pomerantsev, a British journalist with Russian pedigree who worked in Russian TV. Nothing is true and everything is possible. I would say where it's evolved, as I'm looking at certain figures I've known and who spout this, it's all a scam. It's the Worldwide Economic Forum. COVID's a scam. A lot of it's changed since the pandemic. The Russians are very good at boosting this sense that you can't trust medicine. You know, you see these accounts now who said, we hate the Tories, right? But Labour just as bad as the Tories. They're kind of angling towards reform, but it is this distrust in everything. And if you look at these super spreader accounts, there's a pro-Farage thing. They say, oh, the Tories are awful. They're really socialists, conservative socialists. Labour are terrible. So you get, as we've seen in France, as we've seen in Germany, the alternative. And the alternative quite often turns out to have had funding at one part in their future, the AfD, Le Pen, Salvini from Russia.
Oh, the solutions to this. I mean, at some level, we've got an example in the United States of an indictment, but out with law enforcement, and particularly given the enthusiasm with which Musk on X, for example, allows these sources to flourish, what can we do as ordinary punters, as ordinary social media users do to maybe combat some of this stuff? Is there any point?
What I feel like that has really worked since Russia launched their full-scale invasion in Ukraine is transparency, just shedding light on this phenomenon and just like showing how they operate, how they work. But I think there's still not enough talk on long-term solutions, which is basically education. So we have to integrate critical thinking and media literacy into the education system. Of course, it'll take 10 years before you see any effect, but once you see the effect, it's amazing. Usually, Finnish people don't really like saying good things or positive things about Finland, but I want to say nice things about Finland because we have a very good education system where we integrated critical thinking and media literacy into schools and even into preschool. So even children know what is disinformation, what are the consequences of lying, and so on. So just starting early and kind of building on that will create this system of cognitive resilience and resistance of bullshit, basically. And it's very effective. And if you look how Russian disinformation works in Finland, it doesn't really work. Basically, it doesn't have any power right now.
That's very interesting. I think we lack, I mean, there's jokes about media studies. Media studies, what's that? And they dropped it. You know, it's a vital critical thinking around media. And you know who the most vulnerable? I don't know if it's still true. It's certainly true over Cambridge Analytica and Trump and Brexit. Was my age or older, boomers on Facebook. Younger people actually more suspicious, more critical, know how the internet's built. Is that a real page? It's like a conjuring trick. That's why the IRA had to evolve, because once you see through it, once you can jam it, it's almost like the drone warfare. Once you can see that's disinformation, you can jam it. They have to come up with something which isn't easy jammed. And I think these super spreaders are different on there because they aren't the fire hose of bullshit. They're kind of targeted, sharp sprays of bullshit. They realize you can't just swarm with huge bot factories and replicate it. You've got to choose people of influence. So in that arms race, here's the critical thing. I'll ask Pekka what he thinks about this, and that is X, right? I still call it Twitter. I don't care. A lot of people have migrated to things like Blue Sky or Threads or Mastodon. My feeling is the town square of the world, as Elon loves calling it, which it is still, it's bigger than any other one. Then you stay and fight. It's owned by a bad sheriff. It's like we're in a town in Deadwood and there's a bad sheriff, or like high noon. What do? Do you leave town? You can. A lot of people do leave town. A lot of people just keep their heads down and hope nobody will notice. The other one is they're out in the public square now, revealing themselves. I mean, Musk has revealed himself in so many ways. He must be the stupidest man alive, even if he's the richest. And there's something quite important about this transparency, not in education as well, letting them fall over themselves, and then let them expose themselves. The amazing work you do, Pekka. I know you got blocked and sort of unliked by trust and all the algorithms, but showing how they manipulate the system in that combat, if you like, informational combat, is educational in itself.
Yeah, definitely. X/Twitter is a huge battleground where there's a lot of back and forth on this whole thing. And we clearly see Russian influence in there. It's evident. But we also shouldn't forget, you mentioned boomers or older people, that there are a lot of other more traditional media that we kind of forget. So one colleague told me that in Czech Republic, the biggest kind of spread of disinformation is email mailing lists in Czech Republic. In Latvia, it's a Russian language TV. So there are like 20 different Russian language TV channels that are kind of using soft power propaganda to affect public opinion. The whole battleground is huge. So I'm personally focusing more on X/Twitter, but there are a lot of more traditional media that we are sometimes forgetting.
Absolutely. I was on the way to Ukraine this time. I went through Moldova, which is split with this Russian-owned, controlled enclave, Transnistria. And there was some trouble there with not trouble, but people marching and having flags. And a lot of the disinformation there goes through television. And so I think the Moldovan authorities have blocked certain transmitters. Meanwhile, there's this behind the front lines from the Russian side film, I forget what it's called, that's a Cannes or one of these film festivals. It's obviously backed, it's obviously propaganda, but film festivals are a battleground too.
Peter, thank you. Thanks also to Pekka. It's been a fascinating conversation. Pekka's book is called Vatnik Soup, The Ultimate Guide to Russian Disinformation. And Peter Jukes, you can read in the Byline Times. And don't forget as well, we are part of the Byline audio family. Brilliant podcasts like Utter Bollocks by John Mitchinson and Otto English, Adventures in Americana, Bonnie Greer, and Byline Times editor Hardeep Matharu. Check out bylineaudio.com for more. Thank you, Pekka. Thank you to Peter. We'll see you again very soon. Thanks for listening. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Byline